Hi everyone. I'm Ibrahim, and I do recognize the irony of talking about research and saying to speak less, but I will try to keep it brief and kind of go through this different way about thinking about research and how we conduct basically our methods of understanding users and the people that we're working with. So quick intro. So I'm currently based in Boston. So my focus has been around user research, experience strategy, human-centered design, and I had a cross background across consulting, UX, quite a bit with cultural ethnography and computer science. So a lot of my work ends up being at this kind of intersection between strategy, what are we looking to accomplish, design, how do we really understand the people that we're trying to interact with, technology, how do we enable it, and then adding that kind of cultural lens and element to make sure that we're thinking about these products holistically and inclusively across the different kind of stakeholders and groups. So to kind of set the stage a bit in terms of why even talk about this today of basically we have seamless connections about there's no shortage of ways that we can connect with people that we're working with or we're kind of designing for, but it's never been easier to engage. But on the flip side, that there is this kind of fragmented understanding of how do we really get to the core of what people are looking for, especially as designers, product managers, owners, where that responsibility is so high to make sure that we're delivering on the things that people really are looking for. So that's kind of where we are today, and to align a bit on having kind of the central question for the next 20-25 minutes or so on basically this of how do we basically foster deeper understanding of our partners to create more empathetic products and services. And I use partners specifically instead of users, which I'll talk through in a bit, but it's really about that, not just the people that we're designing for, creating products for, but that whole kind of ecosystem around who's involved within the work that we're doing. So with that kind of that challenge, I like to also ground on what are the constraints in which that we try to approach this type of problem, like any design or product problem. And you can think about these kind of three core constraints today. So one of human biases. So grounding in reality today of that we as people are naturally just hardwired to have shortcuts to think through all the stimulus around us, and that's just the nature of how we act. So it's not necessary to think of how do we remove bias when we're doing research, but how to minimize it and address it and recognize it throughout the process. Existing technology as well too. This is not, want to make sure that we're also grounded in the fact that we can't necessarily use something net new, but versus how do we change the way that we're engaging with people through the different tools and services that we currently have at our disposal. And then social dynamics as well, right? To also understand that there are certain things that are kind of ingrained within our society now, for better or worse, that we also need to be cognizant of when we're designing for people who particularly are also may not be so similar in us in terms of kind of behaviors, motivations, and needs and things like that. So these are, kind of the guardrails, I'd say, but outside of that, there's, everything is up for grabs. And so that's why I like to think of this kind of empathy playground around like what's the space that we can work within, and really focusing on those parts to drive the most impact. And I like to start from that of, at first, before even getting into certain research methods and tools, is really what's the mindset that we're, as designers, researchers, going into these types of processes, and have kind of four kind of guiding principles of, one of curiosity, right? Being curious of why might people be interacting certain ways, how are they doing it, and having that kind of that lens that we look, kind of zoom in, zoom out to really understand. Holistic. And so this is where we want to not, solely be thinking about product features, or specific pain points necessarily, versus how does that whole person kind of interact and engage with the world and environment around them. Third being collaborative. This is also some stuff that Jan touched upon as well, that thinking about who are the people in the room. The more that we are speaking, the less opportunity we have to actually learn from others as well. So how can we kind of create this co-creation, collaborative type of approach when it comes to research and ultimate design and execution. And then lastly, iterative. That there's no checkbox of I'm empathetic now, or my empathy research is complete, versus something that's continuously has to be done on an ongoing basis as products change, as our research changes, as we as individuals and society kind of evolve as well. So as we kind of go through the process or the approach to towards this empathetic research, these are kind of the four mindsets, guiding principles we'll come back to as well, but want to have kind of top of mind as we kind of go through the steps. So the three steps really that lay out here. So one is constructing their mental model. Second, investigating with minimal bias. So again, right, they can't necessarily will never be zero bias, but addressing, recognizing, and kind of minimizing it there. And then reorienting across systems, both the systems of the products and what we're designing, as well as the system of the people the people we're designing for. So step one, constructing their mental model. So this is where a lot of kind of cultural ethnography kind of comes into play. Of we really want to anchor on those that we're serving, and as many of you probably have heard, especially with design, of you're not designing for yourself, you're designing for others, and that we have to, as much as we can, remove ourselves from what we're hearing, and there's this separation between what are we observing versus evaluation. And so, as to the extent that we can, really having those research phase, removing any type of evaluation or analysis to pure raw input of this is what the person is saying, the meaning of it or why. Dig into it, but can't say at that point of this is the reason why they feel XYZ, and really thinking about that kind of model from a blank page. We don't want to fit them into our world, our understanding, versus what is an empty canvas that they put them on an empty canvas and then start kind of designing and creating what that worldview looks like. And this is where we're talking about learning more by kind of speaking less, that really understanding and recognizing the power that the words that we have also uses when it comes to kind of creating and understanding mental models. Since the one around just generally of a mental structure, basically shaping the way that they see the world, the goals they seek, and choices that they make. And there's a bit of a priming around the language element, but there's a book, Metaphors We Live By, which basically talks about how the different ways that we describe the world, or the metaphors that we're using, can impact, has kind of implicit bias or implicit perceptions of the world. So a couple here of more is up. There's the idea that it's kind of this vertical idea of around having more. So we think of income is rising, bigger is better. That it goes to this kind of abundance culture where we keep wanting more and kind of increasing. Second of time is money. So especially when we're thinking of as we're designing products or thinking about what needs are, or even marketing them, that a lot of times you hear people say of, we'll save you X number of hours by using this, or we'll help you better budget your time. But even this idea of time can be a lot of ways sometimes linear, or also kind of more circular. So that, and also the value that people place on time isn't the same type of value that they would be placing on kind of money or currency. So it comes to these points that we want to minimize the way that we're talking about potential benefits or features and how we describe them. And another example of saying user groups are community, right? If we want to try to foster community with our users, but first, what does community actually even mean for the users? Is that something where it's everyone is extremely well connected and learning from one another, or it's that we thinking about community as this product or the service is the leader and we're kind of following onwards, that it does impact basically the way that they're experiencing the products and services that we have. So kind of goes to the point of the language, the words that we're saying really drives a lot of the impact of how we understand people. So one also specific example of with language impacting how people kind of experience the world with design as well. So the Shona language, they don't have words for red or orange to differentiate between the two colors. So typically people that speak that language don't even see a difference when you have something red versus orange. So this is, one example where if you're designing a color palette or you're creating a product and you have red and orange, for people that speak that type of language, there won't be any specific difference that they're seeing. So you need to be cognizant of when this is, the what we're saying and describing is going to be different than how the person is kind of perceiving the same kind of the area. And that goes to, again, this not remove from our perspective onto the other person, and really keeping it on observation. And with that in mind, then we can start basically constructing this mental model and doing this type of investigation. And so how to basically do that without saying as much, right? That there's a couple different tools that we can think about. So one is, and this kind of goes to the point around being holistic of it is what people are saying, but then also getting that full kind of empathy map or affinity map of what are they actually doing, what are they feeling, the thoughts that are kind of going through the person's head as they're potentially using a product, or just kind of they're going through their type of day. And this is really focusing on observed behaviors, focusing on the words, the things that they are saying, to kind of get that full picture. And there's a couple ways that we can do this specifically around this idea of language and kind of trying to minimize that type of the bias that can inherently come from how we're speaking. So one is around metaphors. So also taking that idea of metaphors into kind of user research. So one example, for instance, is let's say you have an e-commerce store or website, and that if you think of framing it as product search selection is a genie granting wishes, right? So what are those wishes going to look like? What would that be for you? And then you're removing, right, kind of that specific description of walk me through your experience of going through checkout, for instance, versus now you can kind of get more at the actual end value drivers for the people by kind of framing it, removing it from the product. Second is around visualization. So this kind of removing the speak entirely, where we've done this in person with people drawing or on Miro, and then having people kind of describe afterwards. But one example is for internal work. So if you're in HR or thinking about employee experience, especially now with hybrid models of where people are working, sometimes in person, sometimes remote. That example could be of, imagine the employees are on a bus. What does it look like? And this, there's a lot of interesting insights that comes out of this, where do people describe where are people sitting on the bus, for instance, right? Are people sitting by department? Does everyone have their own seat? Are people grouped by when they join, seniority? Who's driving the bus? Where's the bus going? How many people are driving it? These types of things, now you can start to understand more of how are employees kind of thinking about their experience with work and with their colleagues, which again kind of drives more insights than asking of do you want an open floor plan or a closed floor plan? What type of kind of company culture do you want? These are, ways that you can kind of get to those through a more scenic route, but does kind of minimize some of the inherent bias in terms of how we ask the questions. And it also goes, to power dynamics and kind of things like that. If they think of CEO or executives only as the one driving, and employees have no idea where it's going, or things like this. And then lastly, on surveys. So this kind of goes to that point around the abundance culture as well. But a lot of times that when it's not possible to do in-person sessions, or inherently there's a lot of surveys that will be done to facilitate also user research, thinking about the framing of those questions as well. So for instance, this rating something on a scale of -5 to +5 versus 0 to 10, both have the same number of options. But if we're thinking of this kind of the abundance culture of 0 to 10, we're looking just straight at magnitude, and that 4 may mean one thing, versus if we're saying -5 to +5, then we're getting a distinction between what is overall negative sentiment versus what might be the magnitude of interest, for instance. So these, again, sometimes can feel like small kind of points, but then when we're really trying to understand, especially with surveys, a broad audience, that that these are the kind of things that we want to think about, of how are we framing the questions in a way, and what might be the different interpretations that people might have, as they kind of go through each of them. So as we kind of go through these different types of exercises and ways to kind of have that more empathy driven research, then the third step of kind of reorienting across systems as well. So there's two kind of frames of this. The first is our people, right? So not just was mentioning before, not just the users, where the way that people are interacting with a product as a user is just one very small part of their overall life. But then thinking more of what are the different dimensions and layers, of that person. So the kind of overall patterns, trends, events that we're seeing on top, but then also underlying with structural, institutional, and those mental models that we talked about before, where this kind of gives more a complete picture of the people that we're serving. And I mentioned the another example for this, for instance, is around social media, where right now I'm launching a startup within doing a lot of work with content creators, and there's obviously very different perceptions or ideas around social media, kind of attention economy and things like this. And that when we're speaking to people, particularly who are a lot of creators who are moms, that their own experience with their work as a creator, we found there's impact when they have children, and then they see certain studies, reports about the impact of their kind of attention and development, which are things that obviously then impact how they would be interacting with our product or any social media products. So these are things which only focusing on the product you wouldn't necessarily get, but having that full kind of complete picture provides a more holistic view and understanding. And then once we first anchor on the person, then we can more appropriately look at the product. Oops, sorry about that. The product itself. So there's the product, and we think of the journey map, the kind of specific interactions, but then also what are the other products or services that they're using within, or as a complementary of ours, and then the environment that they're in as well. So examples here of when are people using your product when they're more on the move versus sitting down, for instance, for mobile apps, where this is going to then impact how much you want people really focusing, sitting, looking at the product if they're walking on the street, things like this, versus sitting down and have more time to kind of go through in depth. And one example, if you use CarPlay, like Apple CarPlay for when you're driving, that you'll see with Spotify has a different view basically when they see that you are driving, make things bigger, also minimize the amount of stimuli and data that's being presented because they recognize that you are driving. Right? So that's something that we want to be cognizant about. How we're designing our product is not just the specific buttons, but it's more broadly again and where the person is in that environment as well. And so some specific, some other kind of Einstein leadership of, as we kind of think about this holistically, is one, target customers and market entry and expansion of the customers that we are designing for, that who do we have a really clear understanding of the cultural impact and kind of considerations that come into play with any new market. And as we kind of go through that execution, who's actually involved, is the customer's voice being heard, and if it's not being heard, who is transmitting it, and what are the steps that are kind of diluting that initial source as well, right? So this also that Jan had mentioned as well too, that there's going to be there are research analysis and kind of synthesis that will kind of get to certain insights, but then the different perspectives that are providing that type of input will provide better, more holistic view of it. And then from design as well, so we might mention kind of colors in terms of, from one extreme that people may not even differentiate between red and orange, but also from a cultural perspective, we think of orange as kind of a hazard in the US, but in certain parts of Asia, it's seen associated with positivity, spiritual enlightenment. So here we have to think about what are multiple signals that we can kind of reinforce, what we're actually trying to convey to customers, because they may have different interpretations or understanding of it. And images, obviously, and kind of navigation as well. So a lot of things to kind of think about as we're kind of going through the process. And I'll quickly kind of wrap up of, right, we're in constant state of evolution. So this is never a final check. That is kind of, we are verbs, obviously not nouns. So that having one, recognizing that there is a lot of ways a lot that needs to be done to understand people, but that understanding never kind of ends. So we want to kind of recognize that as we kind of move forward. And I'll give a kind of quick some quick examples of what this looked like in practice with our startup of a movig, basically a business suite for creators to manage the back office of all of their work. So some of the things that I think we had done well from kind of the empathy driven side of, one, recognizing that creators, even what does kind of the business side look like for them, where for small, medium businesses or enterprises, think very kind of clearly around, okay, this is sales, this is, projects, this is the payments. Whereas for them, we didn't initially frame our research around that. We framed it more around, what are your goals for this type of work? What are the areas that you're spending, X amount of time on? And then ended up wrapping it, around the kind of the business side of things. Then second, around visual cues. So this was, again, that there was a bit of a separation between, or understanding that there, as creators, very creative type thinking, as thinking visually, that we kind of reinforced that with how we were designing, conveying the information around, these more kind of business focused topics. And then reinforcing this idea of the journey. So we saw that it was that kind of what that overall journey of with being a creator, how that also is complemented with their own kind of personal journey, that some of people are doing this part-time, and focused a lot of the kind of the business metric success not on how much revenue you're making, but the consistency of your routines to enable kind of the goals that they had from this area. And some of the lessons learned. So one of around kind of time commitments, that this was it was very varied for different people, that we had to make sure they recognize that their vision of success is very different based off of the other stuff that they had going on. And then these kind of educational resources that was much more important than we kind of initially realized. So kind of having that education kind of more integrated throughout as well, and reinforcing that, those routines. So to wrap up here, so some of the key takeaways of when the outputs kind of depend on the nature of our inputs, right? So how we're kind of approaching research, who's in the room, thinking about the language, what we're actually speaking, how that impacts kind of empathetic leadership and research throughout, and recognizing that is, a constantly evolving situation. So we need to, one, construct their mental models, kind of go through this type of investigation, trying to minimize bias as much as we can, and then kind of continuously zooming in, zooming out to kind of get that full picture, and then repeat the process as much as possible. So that's it for today. Yeah, would love to stay connected, and thanks a lot for your time.
Thank you, Ibrahim. That was a really interesting talk. I love the color example, because I hadn't heard that one about orange and red. I've heard ancient languages, they found no description of blue up until kind of modern times. So people would describe the sea as dark wine because they didn't have a color blue to describe it with. So it's very interesting to see how kind of language influences things.
Yeah.
So yeah, if anybody has any comments or questions, please do share them, and I'll ask them to Ibrahim. But I'll start with one. So that was a great kind of deep dive into trying to understand the mental model of kind of a particular person. But what if you have, let's say, multiple personas or multiple different kind of user groups for your product? Do you recommend kind of trying to do it for each? And then where do you draw the line? As in, do you have a persona of one, or how do you draw a grouping around your personas?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think it partly depends on kind of where, if it's a net new, you're starting a new research project, or this is kind of later on where personas have been developed. Typically what we like to do is basically using the mental models to inform the personas as well, so that the personas are less around, certain kind of interactions with products or other services, versus that the people that kind of have a similar value system, for instance, we would want to treat them in one way, kind of in that persona A. And then so using that kind of as one of the inputs, and then there's also a bit of a separation of, that first kind of understanding of these are three kind of groups of people that typically, think X, Y, Z in different ways. But then when it goes to the actual product of, then we need to design, feature A, B, C, like having a social component, for instance. Then it goes a bit into the messaging of like, how is that being conveyed to group A versus group 2? And there could be some overlap there, but it's typically the separation of one is like, these people generally kind of think and behave the same way. And then second of, then we think, how do we kind of address them from a product perspective, if that makes sense?
Yeah, so it's I guess you need to just look at your product and then determine where the right boundaries are. But then once you have those boundaries, follow your advice of kind of getting into the head of constructing the mental models of those people.
Yeah, exactly.
Brilliant. I think that's actually all we have time for. So just want to thank you very much for sharing. I hope everybody out there enjoyed it as much as I did. So thank you once again, Ibrahim.
Yeah, thanks a lot.